Because there's still people arriving, maybe we're going to give them a couple of minutes, like 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Frank Ruder, and on behalf of the Scottish Centre for Continental Philosophy and on behalf of the philosophy program and team at the University of Dundee, I'd like to welcome you to this event in, well, virtual Dundee, I guess, to this event in the Dundee Royal Institute of Philosophy Speaker Series. It's also the last event of this year, so the horrible 2020, but it's not going to be a horrible event, but a real treat. And I'm tremendously happy and very, very grateful to be able to very briefly introduce our very distinguished guest today, namely Katrin Malabou. Katrin Malabou is Professor of Modern European Philosophy at the Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University, London. She is Professor at the European Graduate School, the EGS in Saas-Fee in Malta, and she's Professor at the Comparative Literature Department at the University of California, Irvine, formerly held by Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida I mention only because she did her PhD with him, and it was published in 1996 in French and in 2005 by Routledge in English, and it's the marvelous book entitled The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality, and Dialectic. And she published in French in 1999, in English in 2004, also with Jacques Derrida, Counter Paths Traveling with Jacques Derrida. The same year this book came out in English, she published in French, What Should We Do With Our Brain, which was then translated in 2009 by Fordham University Press, and which is somehow maybe one of the very rare and marvelous works in philosophy where a genuinely new perspective is created through one concept, which allows to bring together philosophy, neuroscience in a, to speak a maybe almost classical language, in a kind of renewed critique of ideology, namely the ideology of flexibility. I'm not gonna go through her numerous already book publications. She published together with Adrian Johnston and with Judith Butler, but numerous monographs. But I just want to tell you about the, I think, two most recent ones, namely an absolutely magnificent work that came out in English in 2019 called Morphing Intelligence, from IQ Measurement to Artificial Brains, with Columbia University Press. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the most recent one, not yet translated into English, Le Plaisir Effacé, Clitoris et Pensée, with Rivage, which is basically the effaced pleasure, clitoris, and thought. All of them, and all those whom I haven't mentioned, are dearly recommended. It is almost, I think, a duty to read and work through Katrine's work if you have the slightest interest in the most thrilling things that happen in contemporary philosophy. I'm going to shut up now and give the word to Katrine. I just wanted to say, after her lecture, there will be a Q&A, which will be moderated by my colleague Ashley Woodward. What you can do is, if you have a question and don't want to come on or can't come on or through your video camera, you can put a question in the chats and we can see how many questions there are. And then afterwards, maybe we have to select some, or we're just gonna read all of them. Katrine is gonna speak to us about philosophy and anarchism, alternative or dilemma, and I'm very grateful and happy to welcome her.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Frank, for inviting me. First of all, it's always a pleasure to have a discussion with Frank, whom I know for so many years now, and he's also a very distinguished philosopher, so it's a pleasure. And I always wanted to come to Dundee, so it's too bad I can't travel physically, but I'll be with you for a while, at least spiritually. So thank you very much for the invitation. I chose to present something about my most recent work. This is a work in progress. I'm working at the moment on a confrontation between philosophy and anarchism. And it's, as I said, it's a work in progress, so it's not yet totally achieved, but I will try to situate the problem I'm dealing with in this new book or research. So I start. So to explore the relationships between philosophy and anarchism amounts to deciphering a long and complex process of disavowal. If many philosophers in the 20th century and beyond have overtly proclaimed their involvement in Marxism, or at least their sympathy for it, none of them, at least in the Continental tradition, ever declared themselves anarchists. None of them ever produced a detailed and patient analysis of anarchist texts. Decisive readings of Proudhon, Kropotkin, Bakunin, Malatesta, Goldman, Bookchin, to talk about classical anarchists, or others, are nowhere to be found. Anarchism has always been, and still is, almost unanimously condemned for being naive, uncritical, and mostly impracticable or unworkable. I quote Alain Badiou, for example. This is just an example. Badiou says, "Anarchism has never been anything else than the vain critique or the double or the shadow of the Communist Party, just as the black flag is only the double or the shadow of the red flag, end of quote. And this, he goes on, because anarchism sets up a simple-minded opposition between power and resistance. And we'll see that this idea that anarchism, sets up a very simplistic opposition between power and resistance is very often invoked as an argument against anarchism. So anarchism would just be a simple and immature anti-movement deprived of any dialectical elaboration or sophistication. However, as I intend to demonstrate, philosophers' contempt for anarchism is very ambiguous. More than a pure and simple rejection, it in reality appears to be a disavowal, that is a type of negation that is veiled, that is a veiled or a repressed affirmation. I will, of course, refer later on to Freud's famous text, Die Verneinung, negation, in which this phenomenon of disavowal is analyzed. So why do I claim this? It is striking to see how some prominent philosophers from the 20th century, while strongly rejecting political anarchism, have at the same time developed strong concepts of anarchy. Such is the case, for example, of Rainer Schürmann in Germany, Levinas, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, Rancière in France, and Agamben in Italy, just to name a few. The contradiction between rejection of anarchism and a kind of promotion of ontological anarchy is the reason why I'm using the term disavowal. This disavowal gets even stronger if we take into consideration the fact that these philosophers are currently considered, Foucault mainly, new voices of this movement called post-anarchism. Post-anarchism is a term coined by the American philosopher Sol Newman. So in this presentation, I won't be able to talk about all the philosophers I just mentioned. I will limit my analysis to 3 of them, Schürmann, Levinas, and Foucault. But before I read them more closely, I would like to state at the end of my introduction that we are confronted today with a strange paradox, which is the paradox of an anarchy without anarchism, of a metaphysical but not political, ontological but not practical anarchism. Why has it become important to analyze those twisted, convoluted structures today? Why is it important to think anew the relationships between philosophy, anarchy, and anarchism? These are the questions I will try to answer in my presentation. So the core trend of all anarchist movements, so we agree that there is not only one anarchism, but plenty of them, a multiplicity of them. So I will have to generalize here, but of course, I don't want to reduce anarchism to just one movement, but I think they all have something in common. However, their diversity, this common point is the radical and uncompromising rejection of both domination and representation. I say domination and not mastery, authority, or power. Anarchy, as we know, comes from the Greek anarchia, which literally means without an arche, that is, without a principle. And we know that in Greek, arche means both beginning and command or commandment. The terms mastery, authority, power, principle are ambivalent to the extent that they possess both a positive and a negative value. Power, for example, Foucault says, is not necessarily a bad thing. Same thing with mastery or authority. I quote Foucault again, I see nothing wrong in the practice of a person who, knowing more than others in a specific game of truth, tells those others what to do, teaches them, and transmits knowledge and techniques to them. In the same way, holding to one's principles can just mean being faithful to oneself. So authority, mastery, power are ambivalent. On the contrary, the concept of domination clearly lacks such an ambivalence. Domination is clearly on the side of the abuse of power. Domination blurs the distinction between use and abuse of power. Domination is synonymous with subjugation, subordination, and alienation. And this is, once again, the core idea of anarchism, this kind of univocality of domination. And such is the reason why Max Weber, for example, stopped using domination, Herrschaft in German, to designate the political constitution in the Greek sense of politeia, and preferred using power instead, thus reserving the word domination to abusive and violent economies of power. We find also this idea in Hannah Arendt's book on violence, where she clearly differentiates, once again, between mastery, authority, power, and domination that is clearly rejected on the side of sheer violence. Anarchist critique of domination immediately echoes the critique of representation, and more exactly, the critique of government in general. According to anarchistic view, whoever is mandated to represent someone else, be it the society as a whole, a group, or a person, if not quickly replaced, is inevitably led to subdue, alienate, dominate the represented, and act like a tyrant in a way or another, or someone who acts only for their own selfish interest. So the critique of domination and representation converge, thus challenging the idea of a necessary partition between those who are meant to govern and those who are meant to be governed. And it is extremely interesting to see that this distinction between those who govern and those who are governed, the necessity of this distinction has never been philosophically criticized. It has never been philosophically challenged, perhaps because all philosophers agree, without always saying it explicitly, that human beings fundamentally need masters. So if we had time, we could very easily demonstrate that even in the most radical philosophers of the 20th and even 21st centuries, the idea that a form of government is necessary has never been, absolutely never been challenged. To insist upon domination does not amount to denying economic exploitation, as Marxists often argue against anarchists. Anarchists certainly not dismiss the critique of capitalism. They never gave up that type of critique. But so it's not a matter of giving up the critique of capitalism, but it is a matter to recognizing that there exists a specific problem of power, a problem that exists on its own. And precisely the problem of power is domination. The problem of power is abuse of power. And such a problem is not only economic, it's not only political, it is also institutional, academic, or psychic, or even domestic. It is clear that anarchism is not only an anti-state movement. The destruction of the state is not even perhaps its primary goal any longer. Anarchism, once again, is first and foremost a question about the mechanisms of domination that raise political issues far beyond the political scene. The great anarchist activist Emma Goldman complained that most radicals, radical feminists in particular, paid attention to only what she called the external tyrannies, while the internal tyrants, operating in small circles, even in one-to-one relationships, remained unexamined and undefeated. In her book, The Tragedy of Women's Emancipation, she declared, "The explanation of such inconsistency on the part of many advanced women is to be found in the fact that they never truly understood the meaning of emancipation. They thought that all that was needed was independence from external tyrannies. The internal tyrants, far more harmful to life and growth, ethical and social conventions, were left to take care of themselves, and they have taken care of themselves. They seem to get along as beautifully in the heads and hearts of the most active exponents of women's emancipation as in the heads and hearts of our grandmothers." So I think this distinction between external and internal dictators is very interesting, because it shows that domination can also act in the most private spheres. I would also like to, on that point, to quote an interview of David Graeber, who left us recently, unfortunately, an interview in which Graeber echoes Goldman's claim. He says, "In academia, there is a hierarchy, and you're supposed to be scared. If you give people complete impunity and power over others, it creates a psychological dynamics which is almost sadomasochistic." "To be an anarchist is not to respect authority?" the journalist asks. "No," Graeber answers. "I think that to be an anarchist is to be critical of authority and always examine if it's legitimate. I think there are forms of authority that are legitimate, but you don't worship authority as a thing in itself. For example, I like the notion of self-subverting authority. I think that there are forms of authority that undermine their own bases, and I think those are very good, like a teacher. If you're a teacher and teach someone very well, you know when they know what they should know, and there are no further bases for authority. If you are a doctor and you cure someone, you no longer have reasons to have authority on that person." End of quote. So domination or illegitimate authority happens when one person is constantly subordinating the other and makes them prisoner. The notion of self-subverting authority or self-subverting domination is central. It is a significant characteristic of anarchist thinking that domination can be challenged, fought against, overthrown even by external forces, but that it also possesses at its core an internal line of fracture, a crack that allows for its self-subversion. So domination contains its own failure in a certain sense. But where is and what is the limit between legitimate and illegitimate authority, between power and domination? When exactly is the frontier transgressed? I think that all these difficult issues are becoming particularly urgent today. The empirical, factual point of departure of my reflection is the fact that we are currently witnessing the emergence of at least 3 global phenomena. First, the multiplication of extreme forms of political domination. Neo-fascist governments in Brazil, and different far-right governments or parties in Europe, rise of white supremacy movements in the United States, rise of neo-Nazism here and there. The list might be, of course, very long. Second, as a contrary dynamics, at least apparently, the birth of movements like Me Too that challenge what Goldman called internal tyrants and more individual types of domination. For many women around the world, Me Too marked a new term in feminism, a new turn in the rejection of power abuse in general. And third, the emergence of spontaneous social protest movements, like that of the Yellow Vests in France, that clearly refused any form of central representation and are clearly rejecting any type of party or union discipline. So it seems it seems to me that today we need a rethinking of anarchism, not perhaps, I mean, this is an open question, to become anarchists ourselves. This is a personal choice, but I think that if we want to radically interrogate what domination is, we have to seriously come back to anarchist theories and try to see seriously their philosophical core, you know, what is at their core and what, well, stop considering this theoretical core as something simplistic or naive. So I'm coming back now to philosophy and to my affirmation, according to which there would be something like a disavowal of anarchism in philosophy. As I mentioned in my introduction, I certainly wouldn't have addressed the problem of the relationships between philosophy and anarchy if the concept of anarchy had not paradoxically constituted a leading thread in deconstructionist and post-structuralist thinking. Some of the most important European continental philosophers, I mentioned some of them a moment ago, and this started with Heidegger. So some of the most important European continental philosophers have determined the task of philosophy as a process of Abbau, Heidegger says, or deconstruction of what one may call the archaic paradigm, that is, the supremacy of the arche of the principle in all theoretical and practical domains. We can distinguish three main trends of such a deconstruction of the arche. The deconstruction of the archaic paradigm in metaphysics, Schumann, Derrida. The deconstruction of the archaic paradigm in ethics, Levinas. The deconstruction of the archaic paradigm in political philosophy, Foucault, Rancière, and Agamben. I think we could put Agamben here. All of them, all these philosophers have elaborated a counter concept of the arche, that is anarchy, as we will see now, focusing on Schumann, Levinas, and Foucault. In his famous book, Heidegger, on Being and Acting from Principles to Anarchy, Rainer Schumann, the German philosopher Rainer Schumann, who in fact wrote in French and who taught at the New School, a very strange character with a very, very strange trajectory. Anyway, so he has this wonderful book on Heidegger and anarchism, in which he characterizes the Heideggerian gesture of Abbau or deconstruction, that is deconstruction. He characterizes this gesture as liberating and anarchic, yet unheard of, not only mode of thinking, but also of acting. The metaphysical tradition was governed all along, Schumann explains, by an essential subordination of practical philosophy to theoretical philosophy via the primacy of the arche. I quote from Schumann. The prime schema which practical philosophy has traditionally borrowed from first philosophy is the reference to an arche. End of quote. For Aristotle, who is the main reference here, and we know that Aristotle more or less invented the philosophical concept of the arche. So for Aristotle, politics borrows its central conceptual schema from ontology and its derivative order. Individual actions and ends are articulated to those of the city, just like accidents refer to the substance or predicates to the subjects as their chief that confers unity to the whole. The archic paradigm then consists in the solidarity between arche and telos, that is the goal. Telos, as Schumann suggests, is not only the complementary notion of arche, it is synonymous with arche. In Metaphysics 11.8, Aristotle declares, everything that comes to be moves toward an arche, that is, a telos. In fact, that for the sake of which a thing is its arche, and becoming is for the sake of its telos. End of quote. Schumann then coins the term teleocracy to characterize the primacy of the metaphysical unity between inception and domination. Teleocracy secures the order of things from arbitrariness and chaos by imposing a normative matrix upon being. Everything has to have a beginning and an end. An end means also telos, of course. Anything that doesn't have a telos is said to be, by Aristotle, impotent, chaotic, and archic. And Aristotle uses the term anarchia in his Politics to designate precisely something that has no telos, and in that sense doesn't even have a beginning. In Schumann's opinion, the Heideggerian deconstruction tends on the contrary, contrarily to the teleocracy, tends on the contrary to let, I quote, the anarchic, anti-teleocratic element freely appear and liberates its force of dislocation and fragmentation. The anarchic thinking is visible in Heidegger through the motives of the without why, without a goal, without reason. The dismantling of teleocracy determines a conception of politics that goes beyond what is usually identified with political philosophy or political theory, which is generally, Schumann says, fed by the principial economy. So Schumann follows Heidegger up to a certain point, but he also abandons it on the road at some point because Heidegger precisely never used the term anarchy. So Schumann radicalizes deconstruction and announces beyond Heidegger the coming, I quote, of a post-hegemonic, non-principial and anarchic understanding of the political. So this is a very interesting project, of course, but here comes the disavowal of Schumann, because at some point, after announcing we are waiting for an anarchic understanding of the political, immediately Schumann strictly differentiates anarchy from anarchism, as if he was trying to decontaminate anarchy from anarchism, or political anarchism. I quote, "Needless to say," he writes, "here it will not be question of anarchy in the sense of Proudhon, Baconnet. What these masters sought was to displace the origin, to substitute the rational power, principium, from the power of authority, princeps, as metaphysical an operation as has ever been. They sought to replace one focal point with another. The anarchy that will be at issue here is the name of a history affecting the ground or foundation of action, a history where the bedrocks yield and where it becomes obvious that the principle of cohesion, be it authoritarian or rational, is no longer anything more than a blank space deprived of legislative, normative power. Anarchy expresses a destiny of decline, the decay of the standards to which Westerners, since Plato, have related their acts and deeds in order to anchor them there and to withdraw them from change and doubt. So you see that here Schumann says, my anarchism, if I want to summarize briefly, the anarchism I am announcing has nothing to do, well, the anarchy I'm announcing has nothing to do with political anarchism. It is political in the sense of decline of ontological principle, while classical traditional anarchism just succeeded in, well, in fact failed, because it just replaced one principle by another, but it did not destroy any all principles. So Schumann repeats several times that his anarchy is an ontological anarchy. And it has nothing to do, once again, with people like Proudhon, Bakunin, and others. I now move briefly to Levinas. The theoretical framework is very different, of course, but the disavowal is the same. Levinas constantly worked at dismantling the archaic paradigm in ethics, the paradigm that has governed the whole Western philosophical tradition. Levinas says in texts like Humanism of the Other, but so very early texts like Humanism of the Other, Humanism and Anarchy from 1968, but then later texts like Otherwise Than Being, he coined the concept of anarchic responsibility. He says that ethical responsibility has to be anarchic, and the concept of anarchy is strongly developed, well, appears as one of the core concepts in Levinas. Anarchy, Levinas explains, and in that sense, he's more radical than Schumann. He says that anarchy means before and beyond all ontology. Being, in the traditional as well as in the Heideggerian sense, cannot be said to resist the archaic paradigm. It is, on the contrary, at one with it. Domination in Levinas pertains to the power of totality, what he calls totality. Let's think of totality and infinity. And ontology is precisely the very structure of totality. Anarchy for Levinas is what lies beyond essence. What lies beyond essence, and we know that the subtitle of his book, Otherwise Than Being, is Beyond Essence. Beyond essence is precisely that space that does not obey any principle, whose economy does not derive from a pre-existing being. It is the space of the utterly other, alien to any command and any beginning. Anarchy, in Levinas, starts with the other, with a capital O, as you know, which means that it does not start. I quote, "Anarchy is more ancient than any beginning and even freedom," end of quote. It is clear at the same time, so we could develop this motive of this anarchic responsibility, because he says, Levinas, that in fact I'm responsible when I obey to an order that I have never heard. It's this notion of obedience in the absence of an order. And Levinas says this is precisely the counter paradigm of domination. I'm free when I obey an order that does not exist. But at the same time, he says, I refuse, I quote, a purely political vision of anarchy. Anarchic responsibility has nothing to do with political anarchism. One of his most brilliant commentators, Miguel Abansur, the French philosopher, declares, I quote, for Levinas, anarchy reaches a realm that is more profound, one that is pre-political, or rather one that is beyond the political and the ontological. It would be contradictory, he goes on, to set anarchy up as a principle in the sense that anarchists understand it. So, you know, for me, what is very mysterious is this, like, what is this more profound space, a space that is pre-political or that is beyond the political? So what is this space that is more profound than what? This is what is not clear. More profound than politics. But what does that mean? It can mean only one thing in Levinas, which is that in the end, even if he declares this or affirms this ethical anarchism, he's a great defender of the state at the same time. So, of course, there's a critique of the state in Levinas, but at the same time, there is the affirmation of the necessity of another state that he calls the messianic state. So he makes a difference between the state of Caesar and the state of David in his Talmudic lectures in 1985. He says, we can criticize the state of Caesar. So the state of Caesar is the Hobbesian state, that is the Leviathan, authoritarian structure. And it is clear that Levinas is critical of that. But he says we have to replace the state of Caesar by the state of David, which has the dimension of transcendence. This is the dimension of transcendence within the immanence of the political. He says the state of David is beyond the state, but it remains a state. Because only a state, which of course is the state of Israel, in a certain, well, we hear that of course at every page, because only a messianic state can guarantee, he says, the existence of justice. So anarchy in Levinas is a kind of contradictory structure, at the same time open and closed, open and shut down. It is true that Levinas has a strong concept of substitution that sustains his anarchism. And we see that in his text on the 1968 revolution in Paris, he plays with this concept of substitution in a very, well, in a way that is very close to the way in which anarchists deal with the problem of domination. I quote, "The radicals of 68, indeed all revolutionaries who best merit the name revolutionary, are characterized by their capacity to substitute ethically themselves for the suffering of other people." So he recognizes that in 68, there was this movement of substitution, the expression of mutuality. And we know that mutual aid, the problem of substitution, is central to anarchism. But nevertheless, Levinas never refers to thinkers like Kropotkin, who also argued against Hobbes that mutual aid and substitution are more fundamental than competition. Levinas never refers to altruism. For him, the anarchist values of mutual aid and altruism are not ethically able to translate the real problem of responsibility. So once again, we find this strange position of ethical anarchism with substitution, openness to the other, and at the same time, defense of the state and rejection of any kind of even ethical anarchistic values. So I will now turn to Foucault's position. So as we know, he first has undertaken a strong deconstitution of sovereignty. Then he turned toward governmentality that designates, as you know, the multiple techniques used by a government to normalize its subjects. We also know that in his famous text, What is Critique? He defines critique as the art of not being governed, or at least the art of not being governed like that. So, and we know that Foucault is the thinker of micropowers, multiple struggles, etc. And for those reasons and many more, Foucault is considered today as a thinker of post-anarchism. Such is, for example, the main argument of a young philosopher, Derek Barnett, in his remarkable PhD called The Primacy of Resistance, Anarchism, Foucault, and the Art of Not Being Governed. He mentions 3 reasons that sustain such a view, like Foucault as an anarchist. First, Foucault's definition of critique, so the art of not being governed. Second, the characterization of the archaeology of governmentality as an archaeology in the government of the living beings. And third, the fact that for Foucault, resistance is always prior to power. Foucault, as we know, analyzed power relationships through antagonisms and strategies that resist it, which brings us close to the idea of a self-subverting nature of power. As we know in Foucault, power is productive and not only repressive. It means that it contains in itself the means of its self-subversion. And it is true that some declarations by Foucault sound clearly anarchistic. For example, he says in the seminar Security, Territory, Population, I quote, "There must be a moment when, breaking all the bonds of obedience, the population will really have the right, not in juridical terms, but in terms of essential and fundamental rights, to break any bonds of obedience it has with the state, and rising up against it, to say, my law must replace the rule of obedience. Consequently, there is an eschatology that will take the form of the absolute right to revolt, to insurrection, and to breaking all the bonds of obedience, the right to revolution itself." So this is an incredibly radical text, to break any bonds of obedience, rising up against it, my law must replace the rule of obedience, etc. And we can also think of the late seminars of Foucault, like The Courage of Truth, for example, in which clearly cynicism is associated with anarchism. However, there are also many passages in which Foucault clearly distances himself from anarchism. The main argument is that classical anarchism has conceived of the relationships between power and resistance as 2 opposed entities. Generally speaking, anarchist vision of power tends to determine power as a substantial unity of forces commanding from above, and that would have to be resisted from the outside, rather than seeing it as multiple, fragmented, and creative. And for example, in an interview called Truth and Its Juridical Forms, he says, I quote, "I am not an anarchist to the extent that I don't admit this entirely negative conception of power." I will also quote another excerpt that goes in the same direction. It's in the seminar, The Government of the Living Beings. Foucault says, quote, "If we define anarchy by 2 things, first, the thesis that power is essentially bad, and second, the project of a society in which every relation of power is to be abolished, nullified, you can see that what I am proposing and talking about is clearly different. First, it is not a question of having in view, at the end of a project, a society without power relations. It is rather a matter of putting non-power or the non-acceptability of power not at the end of the enterprise, but rather at the beginning of the work, in the form of a questioning of all the ways in which power is in actual fact accepted. Second, it is not a question of saying that all power is bad, but of starting from the point that no power whatsoever is acceptable by right and absolutely and definitely inevitable. You can see, therefore, that there is certainly some kind of relation between what is roughly called anarchy or anarchism and the methods I employ, but that the differences are equally clear. And instead of employing the term anarchy or the term anarchism, Foucault says, I shall make a play on words. I will say that I'm proposing a sort of anarchaeology. So this is very famous, the substitution of anarchaeology for anarchism. So we see the same radical, which is the arche, that we find in anarchaeology as well, but the notion of ology, archaeology, adds something to anarchy, which is in Foucault the attempt at breaking something like a too simplistic dualism between power and resistance, to complicate in a certain sense, to bring to light a kind of mutual archaeology of power and resistance, seeing resistance in power and power in resistance. So it's a way, in a certain sense, anarchaeology is a way to say at the same time yes and no to anarchy. So I'm sorry I've been very, very schematic here. Of course, in the work I'm trying to do at the moment, I develop much more in a much more subtle way, patient way. But what I wanted to argue is that in those three positions, we see a strange configuration at work, which, as I said to start with, is like a kind of anarchy without anarchism, a yes and no situation. So this is why I think there exists a strategy of avoidance of anarchism within the philosophical discourses on anarchy. Derrida, who is not exempt from such a strategy, has reminded us of the impossibility to totally hide or exclude one wants to preclude. As Derrida says, all strategies of avoidance fail to avoid what they intend to avoid. In his text, Speculates on Freud, Derrida declares, I quote, "The avoidance never avoids the inevitable in whose grasps it already is." The use then of the term anarchy cannot be independent from the political meaning of anarchy. So I don't think you can use the term anarchy in order to designate ontological anarchy, ethical anarchy, or political anarchaeology. I think it is impossible to use such a term without borrowing something from political anarchism. It is absolutely impossible. That's why I allow myself to speak of a disavowal. How not to think here, of course, of Freud's Verneinung, negation. Let me remind you of the famous beginning of this text, in which Freud says, "The manner in which our patients bring forward their association during the work of analysis gives us an opportunity for making some interesting observations. Now you'll think Now you'll think I mean to say something insulting, but really have no such intention," the patient says. Freud answers, "We realize that this is a rejection by projection of an idea that has just come up." Or, "You ask who this person in the dream can be? It's not my mother. We amend this too, so it is his mother. In our interpretation, we take the liberty of disregarding the negation." Further, I quote one last passage. Freud says, "There is a very convenient method by which we can sometimes obtain a piece of information we want about unconscious repressed material. What we ask would you consider the most unlikely imaginable thing in that situation? What do you think was furthest from your mind at that time? If the patient falls into the trap and says what he thinks is most incredible, he almost always makes the right admission. What he is repudiating on grounds picked up from his treatment is, of course, the correct meaning of the obsessive idea. Thus, the content of a repressed image or idea can make its way into consciousness on condition that it is negated. So, of course, negation is a way to, convoluted way to affirm something. We can then interrogate, in the light of Freud's analyses, the declaration, I am not an anarchist. What would Freud has thoughts of this? I am not an anarchist. Wouldn't he have interpreted it on the contrary as you are one, but there is a reason why you don't want to say it? So several answers are of course possible, because to say I am an anarchist, like Proudhon did for the first time, in his text, What is Property? He said for the first time, I am an anarchist. I agree that it is not an easy thing to say. First of all, because it immediately echoes with terrorism today, so it appears difficult, impossible almost, to say such a thing overtly. Also, it might seem contradictory to use the verb to be and the adjective anarchist, because it is a kind of essentialization of a position that refuses essentialization. So perhaps the fact of saying I am an anarchist is impossible, and maybe the only way to say it is to deny it. That might be the case. And perhaps the philosophers I just tried to read very briefly, perhaps they are hiding their anarchism so that, in fact, we understand that the fact of denying their anarchism is perhaps the condition for the radicality of their anarchism, perhaps more than if they were overtly proclaiming themselves anarchists. So this, I don't know. But I think still that there is a problem. And I would like to end with this question. I'm wondering what philosophy is afraid of. What secret attachment to domination does it maintain that bans it from radically subverting domination? I wonder if there is not something like still a very strong attachment to the master, a very strong attachment to the necessity of the government, a strong attachment to the necessity of the state, a strong defense of parliamentary democracy, which by themselves are not bad things necessarily, but that seem to me contradictory with their philosophical anarchism, be it ontological, ethical, or and archaeological. So raising these questions necessarily leads to re-interrogate or re-elaborate the political promise of anarchism, thus transforming a disavowal, a verneinung, into a genuine alternative. So thank you for your attention. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much, Professor Malabou. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that.
I hope that was clear, because I'm a bit tired at the moment. It's at the end of the term.
Yeah, I think we all are. I think we all are. So yeah,
okay.
We very much understand. Okay, so if any of you have questions, as Frank said at the start, there are two ways you can pose them. You can just put up your hand and we can invite you on screen to ask your questions. Or if you would prefer, you can type your questions into the question and answer chat box. Perhaps while we're waiting for some questions to be raised, I can just begin with one. And it's perhaps one of those slightly unfair questions insofar as I'm asking you about something you haven't spoken about, but it's an invitation to perhaps extend the ideas that you've talked about. So you mentioned the anarchic view of prominent 20th century continental philosophers in relation to a number of areas of philosophy, so metaphysics, ethics, and politics. I wonder about aesthetics, and if you have any thoughts about this. And I was thinking, on the one hand, I wonder if perhaps there are continental philosophers who've developed an anarchic aesthetics, perhaps Lyotard, I'm thinking, but perhaps some others. And on the other hand, I wonder if perhaps there is already something anarchic about aesthetics, and always has been, such as, for example, on the one hand, the tendency of sensation to be fleeting and to escape conceptual determination, and on the other, the way that aesthetic judgment needs to be singular and to take place without criteria. So, yeah, any thoughts on aesthetics?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question, and there would be a lot to say. I don't know if we can say in a very, well, that aesthetic is generally related to anarchism. I would say that it's, well, certain trends in aesthetics are akin to anarchism. And I think mainly of poetry. And as we know, in the 19th century, poets like Mallarmé and his group where, you know, when Mallarmé defines the poem as a bomb, he was very fascinated by, at the time, anarchist terrorism and the explosion of traditional poetry that he's undertaking. He compares this explosion of traditional poetry with political anarchism. I also think, so poetry for sure, a certain trend in poetry, also painting, you know, the, I don't know how to say that in English, the technique of pointilliste in French, you know, to paint with all these little points like that, like Georges Seurat.
Pointillism.
Yes, pointillism is the pictorial equivalent of anarchism. So it's the to put all, it's the, yes, radical equality in painting, so that all the points constitute the picture without any privilege of any of them. So this is also something very interesting. And all these anarchistic tendencies have been analyzed by Antliff, you know, in his book on art. I don't know if you know. So for sure, this is a world, you know, art and anarchism. This is a whole continent. Now, I'm not sure that philosophers, at least those that we have mentioned here, including Lyotard, not that sure that they really develop this kind of anarchist approach to anarchism in art. I'm not sure, but this would have to be developed, because it seems to me that Lyotard remains more Marxist in his approach than anarchist, I would say, but perhaps this would have to be discussed.
Okay, thank you very much. So, do we have some other questions?
There are a few in the chat, actually, I think. Do you see that?
There's one apology. So, from Anonymous, unfortunately I have to leave, but just want to give my thanks to Catherine. Really fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing where this project goes. And from Frank, but not Frank Ruder, another Frank, we have, what about Feyerabend and Dadaism? Or is that only limited to an epistemological anarchism? So I assume it's about, well, Feyerabend's philosophy of science, where he suggests that, well, the quote I remember actually is that he says, oh, anarchism is a terrible political philosophy, but it's a great approach in the sciences. So yeah. I guess the question would be asking whether you've thought about the relationship to scientific method here as well, with the further extension of the concepts.
When Foucault mentions, when he coins this term anarchaeology, he has a parenthesis about Feyerabend. He says, by the way, there's someone very interesting working in that direction in science, and he mentions Against Method by Feyerabend. So I went and I had a look at Against Method. I mean, Feyerabend's anarchism is really, as you said, methodological. It's not political. It is about, it says, the development of the paratactic approach, which is like, this is to say, all theories are equal. I think you find something like that in La Ruelle, more or less. Like, all theories are equal, and it is whatever works. If this one is working, then it's good. So the criterion of truth is just functionality. So all theories are good as long as they work. So whatever works. It's the paratactic paradigm. It doesn't go further than that. So it's interesting, but I wouldn't say that it is politically sustainable. It is just a kind of pragmatism, hyper pragmatism, hyper methodological pragmatism.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Alice Gabriel. Can you explore further the idea of mutual aid in Kropotkin, not only in connection with Levinas, but his philosophy of nature, so to say?
So, absolutely. I mean, in my project, of course, I have these readings of philosophers, but I also want to read anarchists, and one of the most interesting ones for me is precisely Kropotkin and his concept of mutual aid. So I'm extremely interested in that because as Frank was kindly saying, I've been working a lot on the brain and on biology. And of course, with Kropotkin, we touched on a very sensitive point, which is the articulation between biology and politics. So mutual aid in Kropotkin has been interpreted, has been criticized as one of the most dangerous socio-political or socio-biological concepts. How can you ground a political theory on a biological fact? Because as we know, Kropotkin argues that animals don't only compete, they also help each other. So he's not critical of Darwin, but he says Darwin should be, something must be added to the natural selection theory, which is mutual aid, because we notice that animals tend to help each other. And so in human beings, of course, this tendency has disappeared, but maybe we could re-foster it by, in a certain sense, try to find a way to retrieve this very old biological memory. And I find this extremely interesting. First of all, because it has been Kropotkin has been reread in this new theory of symbiosis today, that all biological beings act symbiotically, notably the trees, that there is a kind of symbiotic links between living beings. So Kropotkin's concepts are being revalued today, but of course, the major issue, as I said, is this socio-biological ground that we have to deconstruct. So I'm very much interested in Kropotkin, but we have to find a way to liberate him from the accusation of sociobiologism.
That's great, thank you. Okay, great. So we have a long question from Julian Bagini. So thanks, Catherine. You would be a very bad psychotherapist if you took every disavowal of a client to be an avowal in disguise, but you would be right to think it is telling you something. In philosophy, however, we're careful to make fine distinctions, so we make a disavowal when we are often innocently and sincerely distinguishing our position from one we think it could be confused with. Doesn't the principle of charity require that we should accept disavowal as sincere unless there is very good reason to doubt them, rather than treat them with a priori suspicion? You might reply that we do have special reasons to doubt these particular disavowals, but if so, I would suggest invoking Freud's simplistic principle of suspicion adds nothing to your argument and may even detract from its power, since it makes it look as though your argument is not based on close reading, but the invocation of a dubious psychoanalytic principle.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. This is very simplistic. This is a way it is a way to point. My use of disavowal is a way to point out something like a symptom, and this, I'm adamant that there is a kind of symptomatology here. But I agree with you that it is way too easy to say every time someone says this is not my mother, in fact, it means that it is an avowal. I totally agree. This is very simplistic, and I'm not glad with that. It was a way to once again to point something like a strange symptom, because once again, anarchism is not any term, it's not any kind of word. For a long time, up to the 19th century, it has univocally designated disorder, chaos, absence of state, natural. Hobbes uses it to designate the state of nature. It became a positive term in Proudhon for the first time in What is Property, where Proudhon, for the first time, inverted. This was a semantic revolution, where for the first time, anarchy became not disorder, but another kind of order. It says organized disorder. So for the first time with Proudhon, anarchism, I would say, became a new term. It was not only that it changed meaning, but it became a new term that broke totally with the past. So that saying I'm an anarchist could not mean what it meant, before. And anyway, the adjective didn't even exist. So what I meant with my too simplistic, I totally agree with you, disavowal argument is that how can you, and people like Foucault, Derrida, who pay such an acute attention to language, how can you use a term like anarchy in the positive sense that Proudhon has brought to light? Because for none of them, anarchy, ontological anarchy, ethical anarchy means disorder or chaos. It is positive in their vocabulary. Sherman, how can you make use of such a term that has such a significant history and say at the same time, oh, but it doesn't have anything to do with Proudhon? How would you characterize such a gesture? It is as if I said, I'm talking about proletarian dictatorship, but it has nothing to do with Marx. how can you have such a how can you defend such a behavior? They did not invent the term. You know, it's not only a matter of playing with an, the negative prefix, and archism, like, oh, I found it by myself. You know, I just invented the term anarchism. I mean, let's be serious. They never invented the term. They stole it, consciously or not, from Proudhon. So I agree once again that disavowal is too easy a term. I'm not glad with it. I'm not satisfied, for sure. And at the same time, there is something, I'm sure, like an unconscious gesture here. Like using a term that is absolutely over determined. I mean, you know, anarchism is not any kind of term, and doing as if, you know, it fell from the sky like that. Oh, it has nothing to do with okay, so this is my answer.
Great, thank you. So we have quite a few more questions, actually. So we have one from King Ho Lung. Thank you very much for this wonderful and thought-provoking paper. One thing that came to mind when you suggested that one cannot simply apply the term anarchy to ontology is the hierarchy of disciplines, especially the traditional, if hierarchical, view of metaphysics or ontology as first philosophy. Would the emphasis on the political dimension of anarchy imply a hierarchical prioritization of politics over metaphysics or ontology, thereby creating a new master discourse? On the other hand, if we have an anarchy of disciplines, would we be able to differentiate ontology from politics or vice versa?
Thank you very much for this question. Precisely, this is the problem. I totally agree with you that if we take deconstruction of metaphysics seriously, then what you call the hierarchy or priority of one discipline over the other should just collapse, so that in the end we should have a kind of not identity, but let's say a state of space of indifferentiation between ontology and politics. But this makes the philosophers' refusal of anarchism even more surprising, because you're right that if we have this absence of hierarchy or priority between disciplines, and if ontology and politics in the end merge and enter a new kind of space, then why refuse anarchism? Why this position, once again, that says, oh, okay, I'm using anarchy but not anarchism? It means that, in fact, the old metaphysical overarching position is still playing, is still at play in their behavior. Like, it is as if the archaic was coming back on the scene and saying, no, me as a philosopher, as a metaphysician, I can't really say I am an anarchist, because ontology and politics are not one and the same. You see, precisely this space of indistinction hasn't been, I think, in deconstruction, hasn't been really achieved.
Thanks. A question from Brian Bigansky. Great talk. I have a big, perhaps orthogonal question. Is anarchy, be it political, ontological, etc., possible, given that we are laden with concepts that tend to make us see the world as rule-governed? In other words, isn't the fact that we see the world conceptually, doesn't the fact that we see the world conceptually nullify the principlelessness of anarchy? Sorry about that. I hope that's clear.
Okay. So very interesting question. This is, you know what, because we should also envisage the other side of the dialogue, which is the side of the anarchists themselves. Many anarchists precisely reject philosophy exactly for the reason you're mentioning. Like, we don't need these concepts, because as soon as we conceptualize something, we as the gentleman from the previous question was saying, we over prioritize, we build hierarchies, and so concepts are immediately contradicting the very idea of equality, horizontality, etc. The problem is that how is it possible to defend, to build a vision of a society without government, of a society without domination, a society without hierarchy, without concepts? Don't you think that at some point we should stop opposing this kind of desire for absence of representation, dominance, etc., and the desire for conceptualization? For me, I understand what you say when you speak about the hierarchy that accompanies conceptualization, but at the same time, concepts are our friends. They are not our enemies. I think this is the first thing. If we are philosophers, we have to consider concepts as our friends, and precisely deconstruction is this kind of internal struggle within conceptualization, like how to turn the overarching power of concepts against itself, so that we can really transform it. And Deleuze has beautiful developments about that, as you know. We can deterritorialize conceptualization from its overpowering tendency. So for me, concepts and politics are absolutely not, antagonist.
Great. So I suspect this question may have already been partly answered by what you just said, but I'll read it anyway and see if you have anything to add. So Mark Robson asks, I wonder whether there might be a relation between the tendency towards anarchy without anarchism and a tendency to disavow philosophy itself as a discipline from within the discourse of philosophy. And he gives the example perhaps of Rancière's interdisciplinarity. Would you like me to read that again? Was that clear?
I understand, but I don't see interdisciplinarity in Rancière. I'm sorry, I don't.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. Indisciplinarity. Indisciplinarity.
Okay.
Sorry.
Or maybe I didn't understand. Yes, of course, you're right, but this is perhaps another problem of disavowal. I don't know. You're right that all these people, Foucault, Schumann, Derrida, Levinas, etc., they say also we are not philosophers, of course. And this is very interesting what you're saying, because we might, you're right, equate the I'm not an anarchist with I'm not a philosopher. So the tendency to distance oneself from philosophy is a very common gesture in contemporary continental philosophy. It has become a kind of signature, I would say, but I don't take it seriously. I'm sorry, but I'm not taking that seriously. You know, that people like Rancière say we are not philosophers. Of course we are. So perhaps it's like, you know, it means we're not philosophers in a dogmatic sense, but for me this is a kind of vanity, you know. Personally, I don't see the problem in acknowledging oneself as a philosopher. So I see what you mean. But I can't take it seriously. Dismissal of yes, one position as a philosopher, one identity as a philosopher.
So this is from Manos Apostolidis. Thank you so much for this insightful lecture. I wonder if you see any connections between the concept of anarchy as you developed it and your view on neuroplasticity. Does the brain dominate us? Do we dominate the brain? Or should we not read a power struggle into it at all?
Yes, thank you very much. So I was just briefly touching on that when I answered very insufficiently on Kropotkin. Definitely the network organization, I mean the way in which the neural networks are working is very interesting because, as you know, the functioning of the brain is without any centrality, and the way in which the brain works is the opening of what is called a global neuronal space in which different neural connections interfere, and in certain activities, then they disappear, then some others are firing. So it is true that even if the brain is made of different localizations that are determined, that are predetermined, the way in which neural connections fire together is transcending all these locations, and there is a real collaboration between the brain areas and regions. So, of course, it is very interesting and very tempting to see the neuronal global space as an anarchistic way of functioning. The problem, once again, that I expressed regarding Kropotkin is how is it possible to avoid being accused of sociobiologism, like grounding a political model on a biological reality. So it means that we have to be very careful and invent a critical way of articulating biology and politics. But yes, definitely. My work on neurobiology has been very inspiring for me, politically speaking. Yes, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is from my colleague Dominic Smith. I buy the argument regarding anarchism, but I'm thinking about anarchism as a compound and wondering, is what is being disavowed often the ism? For example, I'm Martin Heidegger, not an existentialist, or I'm Michel Foucault, not a post-structuralist. Is this kind of disavowal the same disavowal or a different kind of disavowal and potentially a more conservative disavowal?
Excuse me, what is a more conservative disavowal? I didn't get the end of the question, I'm sorry.
I'll just read it again. Is this kind of disavowal the same disavowal or a different kind of disavowal and potentially as or more conservative a disavowal? So, Dom, I'm not sure if you want to clarify what you mean by conservative.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I meant, I suppose, maybe conservative is the wrong word. I just wanted to think through its relationship to the type of disavowal you were identifying in thinkers who didn't want to own the political aspect of anarchism.
It is, of course, we know this rejection of the isms. You're right to mention that very often. Well, I'm not, and how many Marxists have said, I'm not a Marxist, it's Marx without Marxism. I think Althusser said something like that. Marx, I don't remember the exact phrase, but anyway, so this rejection of isms, I agree. What I meant is that people, for example, who say, I'm I'm interested in structuralism, but I'm not a structuralist. I am involved in the reading of Marx, but I'm not a Marxist. It means that, oh, there's echo, I don't know. It means at the same time that these people think that they are closer to the core of the doctrines than the ones who hide behind the isms. So to say, I'm interested in structuralism, but I'm not a structuralist, in fact, can be interpreted as I'm more authentically structuralist than the ones who hide behind the structuralism. There's a kind of desire of authenticity, if you want. So the rejection of the ism is very ambiguous, because in a certain sense, it means we are not followers like Marxists or structuralists, but at the same time, we are more authentically following what is at stake in Marxism or structuralism. With anarchism, the situation is a bit different because none of them, I mean, the philosophers I've been trying to read, none of them is even interested in reading the text by anarchists, you know? So they can't even say, I'm not an anarchist because in a certain way, I am closer to the core of anarchist theory, because they don't even know what it is about. I'm sure that people, even great thinkers like Foucault, their knowledge of anarchism is really limited. I'm not even sure that any of them has read with pencil in hand texts like mutual aid or what is property, or so the rejection of anarchism in that case is not only the rejection of the ism, but it is also the ignorance of any other way of relating to anarchism. I hope I'm clear.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah.
No, thank you for your question.
Okay, so we have a question which picks up on this question, and then we have a couple more questions which are more directly about anarchism as a political movement. So let's move to a question from Patrick Levy, who writes, "Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My question builds on your response to or dismissal of the modern tendency to claim that one is not a philosopher. I wonder whether the relationship between philosophy and anarchism is intimate in a similar way, structurally speaking, to the philosopher and wisdom. Would you see a similar relationship to the impossibility of achieving one's result and of becoming or consuming what one loves? More generally, I'd be interested whether you think the question of love would fit into your aim to think the and between philosophy and anarchism, or perhaps desire is more useful here."
Thank you very much. So that would mean that there is a kind of structural anarchism of philosophy since the beginning. In a certain sense, this is true. I think that the last seminars by Foucault, as you know, his readings of the Greeks, Plato included, the Plato of the Laches on courage, goes in that direction. Also his reading of cynicism. But I think, to answer your question, what I'm thinking about immediately is a very beautiful text by Schumann on Plotinus. For Schumann, Plotinus is the first, in a certain sense, the first anarchist. Because, so this is negative theology to speak briefly. Plotinus has said that the problem with a principle, an arche, is that it can't be too far away from what it is the principle of. Because if it is too far away from what it is the principle of, then it becomes the principle of nothing. At the same time, it can't be too close to what it is the principle of. Because if it is too close, it becomes one of the principiated. So the problem with the principle is that it never has the right distance, never can find the right distance between itself and what it commands. So that the only way to be a principle is to not be a principle, hence negative theology. So it's not exactly love, but it is the thinking of a kind of transcendence that denies itself as such, because transcendence, as I said, is either too close or too far away from that which it transcends. So it's not love, but for Plotinus it is desire. So for sure, this kind of self-annulation, this kind of self-negation of transcendence is what at the same time puts everything into movement, and it's a kind not of love but of desire. So I recommend this text by Sherman on Plotinus, and thank you for your question.
That's fascinating, thank you. So as I said, we've got a couple of questions which are more directly about political anarchism. So we have one from Zoro Zechev, who writes, "That was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Professor Malabou. Do you think an anarchistic way of life is applicable today? Is it possible to abolish all kinds of power, i.e. government, or is anarchism just a utopia? Do you think the May events in 1968 were really sensible? What role did anarchism play in those events? What is your opinion of the Paris Commune?"
So thank you very much. So it's huge. So I don't know if I can answer really in a few minutes, but of course this is something I hear very often. Do you think anarchism is applicable? So it is interesting to see how to analyze this reaction. Immediately people say it is not possible. So perhaps it is not possible. If you ask me about the commune was a very counter example. It proved that something like anarchism could work, and there have, as you know, there have been many examples of communes, and still now in Chiapas in Mexico, or in Kurdistan, or in many regions of the world, you have anarchistic communes, and also prefigurative actions of many sorts here and there in the world. So we have examples that anarchist phenomena, let's say, anarchist manifestations can exist. But I would say that before judging anarchism as a utopia or as an impossibility, what interests me in anarchism is the exploration of that very fundamental question, which perhaps you're right, is that appears very simplistic, but at the same time that is very profound. Where does the origin of the difference between those who govern and those who are governed, where does it come from? What is the origin of the dissimilarity between those who command and those who obey? Anarchism is not about disobedience. Many people think that anarchism is about civil disobedience. It's not that. This is just a manifestation of it, but it's not. I mean, the problem of anarchism is not we should disobey. No, the question, which for me is a true philosophical question, is where does this difference comes from? What is it to receive an order and to obey? What is an order? What is an imperative? And on that point, Agamben has a great text What is a commandment? Which is a great text where he asked this question. How is it that we accept to be commanded? So it's not that much, how do we accept to be commanded by this or that person, but in general, what is this what is this disposition of our being that leads us to accept the orders? So I don't know if it's possible to live without that. I don't know if a society without government is possible. But what I think is that we have to return to that question today. We have to elaborate a new theoretical approach to that question. Because it seems to me that we are reaching a state now where domination is getting stronger and stronger every day. The fact of being governed in the Foucaultian sense, of being commanded, becomes so massive and so obscure that it seems to me necessary to go back to these very simple questions. Then we'll see if something is possible. But before judging about the utopian character of anarchism, perhaps let's go back to the very core questions. This is how I would answer right now, for the moment, at the moment.
Thank you. So we have another question which is perhaps somewhat related, but the question of Caesar has gone to the trouble of giving me some pronunciation tips, which is a good opportunity for me to apologize to everyone whose name I've mispronounced so far, and I'm sure I'm going to do it anyway, despite the pronunciation tips. But in any case, this is from Caesar Rudnicki, who writes, a very general question. What do you think about co-ops, about cooperative tradition? In Poland, we have an over 100-year-old tradition of anarchist cooperatives and anarchistic concepts of democratizing power in co-ops, especially Edward Abramowski's and Jan Wolski's works. Do you see in co-ops potentiality to create anarchistic economics?
Yes, I mean, my answer will be very simple. Yes, absolutely, 100%. I totally think that co-op and horizontal solidarity is a key factor to political emancipation today. You know, one reason for this research project that I have is that I don't personally, I stopped believing in any kind of party form. I must say that I'm tired to receive orders from above. And so I do think that, yes, the co-op model, economically, but also politically, and as a way of life, and if we think of ecology as well, yes, I do think this is like this self-organization power of the people. Yes, absolutely. So I unfortunately don't know the Polish tradition you're mentioning, but I will check. Thank you very much.
Great. And so I think it's over to you, Frank. You said you had a question?
Frank, he will kill me.
that is right. No, not at all. But I'm curious about. So I want to say two things. And one about the disavowal and the Freud conversation you had with Julian. I mean, Freud's point could also be read by trying to negate the mother in this dream is not about my mother. I create a new object. I create something new, a new entity, namely the not mother, right? Which is the mother with all the negative libidinal contents combined, right? So we don't only get mother and the negation of the mother, we get also the mother plus the negation. So the two together, right? So an internally negated mother. And it seems this must have something to do with the way in which it is difficult to directly affirm anarchism, right? I mean, this must be a similar problem. And I was thinking, when I was listening to you, well, one, and this is not meant as a critique, but I'm just like really puzzled and bewildered by this for some time. There is this wonderful text by Fernando Pessoa, which is called The Anarchist Banker.
Banker, yes.
And the anarchist banker basically has the theory that the best way of being an anarchist is to become the head of the bank. Why? Because the most perfect form of anarchism ever invented is capitalism. Right, that is the subtext. Now, I'm not making this equation, but I'm saying, and this is something that you even find in late Lenin, right? I mean, late Lenin basically always speaks of the anarchist tendencies of late capitalism, right? So deregulation everywhere and these kinds of things. So there seems to be, and this is a tricky question, and I just want to hear what you think of this. There seems to be a danger of anarchists' position becoming assimilated by the capitalist system in a way that is not anarchist at all, but totally for the re-endorsement of authority and so forth. But how would you ward off these kinds of assimilation without authority?
So yes, thank you very much, Frank. This is an immense question. I mean, the right-wing anarchism and left-wing anarchism, and you're right that libertarians, capitalist libertarians, are also arguing that we don't need a state, that we don't need to pay taxes, that we can organize ourselves, our own defense. And I've tried to read Nozick books on anarchism. That is very difficult, but State and Utopia, etc. So I know a little bit about right-wing anarchism. You're asking me, how is it possible? Well, how is it possible to contradict libertarians? I mean, these extreme tendencies of libertarians. We were talking a moment ago about these anti-coronavirus measures, like far-right people demonstrating in the streets and presenting themselves as libertarians, and you say we need a kind of authority against them. Yes, but the problem is that whatever the authoritarian measures that can be taken against them, I mean, technology is totally favoring the emergence of libertarianism. If you think of the development of cryptocurrencies, of everything that we can do by ourselves on the horizontal, according to horizontal paradigms, I mean, practically all of our activities today are libertarianly determined. So in fact, we have to be clear, no power can do anything, or at least only partially, against the development of hyper libertarianistic activities. I mean, even something like Airbnb is in a testimony of that kind of spirit, where everyone is his own master on a horizontal basis, and soon we can buy our own currencies, and we can stop paying taxes, etc. We can fight against national currency, etc., etc. So unfortunately, and this is another reason why I started this work, I think that capitalism today is knowing a kind of anarchistic turn that is absolutely manifest, and that there is a struggle within capitalism today between authoritarian capitalism, the power and the state of the state, and this anarchistic turn. And I think Trump is incarnating both tendencies. So if you're asking me, what can we do against that? I think nothing, except perhaps conceptualizing, thinking what anarchism is. Because of course there are great differences between this emancipatory anarchism I'm talking about and the libertarian principle. But I don't think that the state can be the referee, between the two tendencies. I think this is a political position that we have to do, because I do think that the army, etc., can't do anything against the libertarian turn of capitalism.
Thanks. This was really helpful. Thank you.
I don't know if it's helpful because it's totally like that. I mean, it's gibberish, but I mean, I'm fascinated by the cryptocurrency phenomenon, for example. I think this is incredible, that we now have means to avoiding, the centrality of national currencies and banks and everything. So at the moment, it's still very, it's a minority, but
So we have several more questions. I'm not sure, Professor Malabou, how you feel about continuing to be interrogated. Do you?
What do you think? One or two?
Okay, sure. Thank you. So we have a question from Povilas Dombliauskas.
Ah, yes, he's an ex-student of mine.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains why he writes. Thank you for the talk. Brilliant as always. Towards the very end of your talk, you raised the question of the relation of domination and philosophy, its attachment to a master. Could you expand more on this? These terms, domination, master, attachment, suggest Hegel and your reading of the master-servant dialectic in the Phenomenology. How, if in any way, could Hegel's philosophy help us to think the problem of philosophy's relation to domination? Can Hegel help us to think anarchism? Or could perhaps anarchism give us a new perspective on Hegel's philosophy?
Yes, thank you very much, Povilas. I mean, here you're touching on something immense. I don't know. I'm asking practically every day. I'm asking myself, what would Hegel think about that? Of course, immediately someone would argue immediately, oh no, Hegel, absolutely not. He's a thinker of the state and of, as you say, the master. So, but I think it's more complicated than that, because as you know, I mean, if dialectic is as powerful as he says it is, then it should be possible to think of a dialectization of the state and of the domination paradigm. But at the moment, I don't know how to integrate Hegel in my research, but I'm sure that there is a way, but I haven't found it, I must say. If you do, Povilas, please email me. No, I would be very interested to pursue the discussion. At the moment, I'm at the, I don't know.
Okay, so we have a question from another of our colleagues at Dundee, Oisin Keohane, who writes, thanks very much, Catherine. That was great. I had to leave to collect my daughter, so I did not hear the entire talk, but I heard you speak about Heidegger and Derrida early on. Have you, in relation to this recent work, examined Heidegger's notion of das Machtlose, the unpower, which is beyond power and lack of power, Unmacht, as described in his 1938 Mindfulness, or Derrida's notion of unpower, impouvoir, as opposed to impuissance? I'm interested in their unusual prefixes and suffixes, the non-privative and its relationship to the an of anarchism.
Thank you very much. So thank you, because no, I haven't, I didn't have that in mind when I wrote the talk, but I will check, and this is very interesting. Yes, the unpower, and I'm sure, of course, that Schumann had worked on that quite a lot, because his idea of Heidegger as a thinker of anarchism has, of course, obviously something to do with this unpower. So you're right about the negative. Well, the an, is it a negative prefix? I think this is a true question for Heidegger. Every time we have a negative prefix, Heidegger is intervening to say, perhaps this is not as simple as a negative intention. Let's say it's not. It has nothing to do with an intentionality, but with what. So it is true that if we think of anarchy in the Heideggerian, if we follow this Heideggerian way to try to understand what anarchy means and to stop seeing an as a negative prefix, then what do we see? This state of non-power, what is it? Or impower, what is it? So I've, even if I, as I said, did not really follow this non-power in Heidegger, I've interrogated myself quite a lot about what is it, this non-negative an in anarchy, and what is that space? Aristotle, in his, I think it's in the Politics or in Metaphysics, I don't remember, says anarchia. He compares anarchia with the situation of an army who suddenly looks behind, you know, all the soldiers look behind and don't see the general. And he says, this is anarchia, when you don't see the general anymore. And I wonder if it is what we see in that space, because I think Aristotle's approach, like the absence of the chief, is precisely the negative understanding of anarchy. It's like, you know, in Apocalypse Now, in the movie, you remember these soldiers that are left alone, and the hero of the film comes to them and say, who is your general? And the soldier, one of the soldier answers, aren't you our general? So they are lost, they don't have their chief anymore. This is the Aristotelian notion of anarchy. And this is not what Heidegger means. And this is not the impower. This is the absence of power, which is very different. So this space without power, what can it be? So Heidegger says it is the absence of origin in a non-negative way. And this is where he has this difference between beginning and origin, precisely. So this is a space where we don't see any beginning, we don't see any chief, but we see something else. It's not an absence, it is something else, which is something more fundamental than precisely the chief or the beginning. Something more fundamental that he calls the morning. So this is also something that we would have to think about, which is that in fact when we say anarchy means without beginning and without commandment, perhaps this without reveals a more fundamental understanding of what begins and what commands. And I think this is what Heidegger would say, that maybe the in-power that you're talking about appears as something perhaps more originary and more powerful in a very specific way than just the absence of power or of beginning. And this even more powerful element, even more powerful than power, might be what he calls necessity, ananke. That also has this prefix. But I don't want to go too far into this, but thank you very much, because I think this is very helpful to the extent that, yes, we should not understand anarchy as a privative, negative prefix only. Otherwise, I think we miss what is at stake. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question from Thomas Wynne, who writes, in regards to one of your last points, would you agree that anarchism does not fall into total negation and that in fact anarchism has been disavowed by these thinkers purely for the fact that it seems that it cannot act? I see anarchism as having a potential power in being able to sublate to the notion of power back into itself, sublating power back into the power of the people itself, the people who make up the community. I see the critique against anarchism as paralleling the critique of postmodern thought. The power of postmodern thought lies in its sublation back to an originary, not in its negation of everything, i.e. power.
The problem, yes, thank you very much. So I will answer as I can. I mean, as far as I understand really what you mean. The problem of this non-privative prefix and the problem of that space that is not negative, but that is an opening to something perhaps more powerful and more originary. The problem is that it does not exist. It has never existed. Heidegger, as you know, is adamant about that. It's the Lichtung of being, and of course it does not exist. It is not a being, it is not a thing. And similarly in political anarchism, and we should be aware of that the fact of not being governed, the fact of not receiving orders, etc., has never existed. So in fact, we have to retrieve this memory of that space, that originary space of non-commandments, etc., etc. We have to retrieve it while we never experienced it. So we have to be aware of the fact that yes, anarchism is not a privative prefix, but we know that because we don't know what it is. We never experienced it. As you know, for Heidegger, the origin has always been covered. It has always been oppressed, repressed, because it hides itself also. So this is something very interesting in anarchism, which is that, in fact, and this is why it is assimilated with utopia or utopianism so often, it is because it does not exist. In fact, this space of non-power does not exist. And at the same time, it is the only thing that puts thinking into movement. So I don't know why I say that. I don't know if I'm answering your question by saying that. But I think this is something important to keep in mind. That of course we have some empirical phenomena, as I said, of anarchism. Of course we have anarchist groups, we have anarchist movements, we have anarchist experiences. But in fact, this the state of non-domination, this kind that Heidegger also is talking about, this state of in-power, which is much more originary than domination. This is not a being, so it does not exist. But it is not because something does not exist that it is a utopia. So I'm sorry, I think it has nothing to do with your question, but this is what it inspired me.
Okay, I think we're almost done. There's one final question, which I think is an issue you've probably already addressed, but I think perhaps I'll read it simply for the reference and we'll see whether you would like to respond or not. So it's from Kevin Dunn, who writes that Friedrich Hayek drew influence from his work on neuroscience, how natural connections of the brain were like the connections and disconnections of markets. Is there a danger that anarchism in practice may lend itself to individualist, market rule, government planning or regulatory authorities?
Yes, this is, thank you very much. I think Frank was going in that direction as well. It is true that today this is also something that we have to be aware of. As I said, I mean, capitalism is entering this anarchistic turn for sure, in which everything is decentralized. Everyone becomes, in a certain sense, the government of oneself, as Foucault used to say. We're entering constantly these platforms on which we can do everything horizontally without any kind of intermediary, etc. It is true that the brain seems to reflect that. For sure, there is a mirroring. It's necessary. Each epoch is a kind of adjustment between technologies and the state of the organism. And for sure, today, brain plasticity is mirroring cybernetics and vice versa. And you're right that the risk is this hyper-individualism that we witness every day, for sure. But once again, how can we challenge that? Is there any kind of party or politics coming from the state? Or I don't think so. I think the only way, and this is the point where I find Graeber again. I feel very close to Graeber. I think that the only way to challenge that is to find the crack in these situations, that is this point of self-subversion of capitalistic logics. The only thing we can do is to struggle on the same ground, which is horizontality, and to try to subvert the use of these platforms, be they cybernetic or political, and to subvert them, to turn them against themselves. This is, for example, what I try to do in my reading of the brain, because so many neurologists today defend the vision, as you say, of the brain as totally individualistic in its functioning. I think, on the contrary, we have to show that there can be something like a critical neurobiology, that the functioning of the brain is very promising, politically speaking, But what I think today, and maybe this is my Hegelianism, to go back to Povilas's question, that in fact the only way to struggle against something is to subvert it from the inside. I can't think of any other way, at least at the moment. Yes.
Thanks so much. So I think we'll draw to a close and send a massive...
always able to answer your very interesting questions. I did my best.
That was fantastic, very stimulating thought. And I just as a closing note, it occurs to me that so we call our research centre here the Scottish Centre for Continental Philosophy. And when we launched this a number of years back, James Williams, who was with us at the time, read a statement in which he declared that we are anarchists. So I think it's he declared that we are anarchists.
Really?
Scottish Centre for Continental Philosophy, he did.
Wow.
So it's a great pleasure to hear your talk about anarchism tonight. And thank you so much for your time.
I was expecting more Scottish accents.
Yeah, we had one, Dominic.
Dominic, yes. I heard Dominic's accent, because I love this accent. No, I mean, I would so much like to come to Dundee one day. I hope this is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, we'd love to have you here once things normalize. Yeah.
Oh yes, let's hope. they will soon. Anyway, thank you so much for your
Thank you
invitation.
again.
Thank you for your questions. It was very, very interesting for me and very helpful. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Kachi.
Bye bye, Frank. See you soon.